Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Better Body Radio. Today we are the Better Body Radio show, and today the topic is going to be around training, which I will lead with. This is my bread and butter for sure, and the thing I enjoy talking about the most. So what we're going to talk about specifically today, well, we're going to talk about the concepts of volume and intensity and the different schools of thought that are I suppose, currently floating around in the industry at the moment. If you were to log on to many popular podcasts at the moment, like Revive Stronger, and you were to listen to different sides of the thought process, you might listen to Mike Hildreth on one podcast talking about his maximal recoverable volume and all the different MEV, minimum effective volume, and all of his different concepts that he's created around this idea of progressing volume to achieve progress with your training and hypertrophy goals. On the other side, you might go to some of the other camps where you've maybe got people like Jordan Peters, Dante Trudell, Dr. Scott Stevenson, who talk about this idea of really progressing intensity in terms of achieving hypertrophy long term. So we're going to touch on essentially those two ideas or philosophies around progression, what our thoughts are, what we've seen in practice as coaches for myself over the last 10 years and Mark over the last 27 years. And then we'll just give some closing thoughts as to where you as an individual might apply those concepts to your own training. How you doing, Mark?
Hey, how are you? Good?
Yeah, very good. So I think we've both probably got a lot to offer as far as this topic is concerned, but I think I will just dive in initially to...
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, both that. It's the one I like to spend.
Coffee.
Yeah, a cup of, I know it's like, I'm not going to say cup of tea because I don't drink tea unless it's a good chai Indian tea, which is pretty good. Oh, there we go. The coffee snob in me turns my nose up at your Starbucks. Right, let's dive in. So let's talk about training. So as far as training principles are concerned, we know that when it comes to achieving progression in any form of training, whether it's strength, which is very much what we call a neurological adaptation, which is it's an adaptation between the brain and the muscle tissue and the ability to maximize force production and as efficiently as possible move a load from A to B. It could be progressing in terms of muscle size, which is a hypertrophy-based adaptation, which just essentially means that the muscle tissue responds to the stress imposed on it. And with those micro tears that are broken down, it then comes back to repair stronger and bigger, hopefully, in the idea that it's going to have to face increased demands at a later date, or a later stage. So these are both very different goals. However, the constant tenet that is there is progressive overload. Progressive overload meaning that we need to apply progressively increased demands over time in order to achieve increased stimulus and adaptations. So this is just the general premise of training. Now, there's generally speaking going to be two camps or two schools of thought. Now, if you look back years and years and years and years ago when it comes to just the initial models of training, you look at some of the initial books. I'm trying to think what it was. It was that Russian guy. This is the terrible time to forget the name of one of the most important books of our time as far as training. Super Training, Mel Sith. So if you look back to Super Training, you look at a lot of the initial work of the different scholars around training and building muscle tissue. It was very well accepted that both volume and increasing load were both very acceptable ways to progress your training. And I think to this day that still holds. I don't think we can argue that volume doesn't have a place and that increasing intensity, adding more load to the bar over time, doesn't have a place. Do you want to add to that, Mark, before we dive into each one?
Not really. It's just funny you mentioned that about the Russian book, because I remember going back to, I don't know if you ever heard of the Bulgarian burst system.
Yeah.
Where it is basically you were almost doing planned overtraining, a lot of volume, increasing your weights, and then you would do that for 3 weeks, and then you have 3 weeks where you're backing everything off and you overcompensation. So yeah, it's a very interesting topic for me, but I'll let you continue. Yeah, it just came into my head. Sorry for the little sidetrack.
This is exactly what we need, though. It's those little nuggets that come in the little asides. Yeah. That's what we're looking for. So yes, let's, I suppose, dive into, before we even get into like intensity versus volume and these kind of two camps that have almost emerged over the last decade, probably just talk a little bit about popular training methodology that's kind of occurred over the years. So for anyone that's been around for the last 20 years or so, even before I got into the industry or as I started in the industry, Charles Poliquin was very popular at that time, and there's a lot of questionable aspects around his nutrition beliefs. However, one thing he was known incredibly well for was how good he was with the training side of things, in particular training athletes. Now, the problem with that is that then a lot of those protocols and a lot of those thought processes then got applied to the general population. The problem with that is that the general pop are not full-time athletes, are not Olympic athletes. And so there were certainly some parallels that you could draw from many of those styles of training when it came to eliciting growth, eliciting changes, improving fat loss outcomes. However, there was a lot of principles and methods that were potentially a little bit too advanced. Unfortunately, what ended up happening is you got these really complex and intricate progression models, such as, and I'm sure you've seen this, Mark, like, and there's a lot of coaches nowadays who still run these type of models. They run the whole accumulation, intensification blocks. And there's nothing inherently wrong with those. However, these were, you've got to remember, were designed initially for strength athletes. They were designed for Olympic lifters, power athletes, where they were going through phases where they kept intensity a little bit more set and they were progressing volume, and then they kept volume a little bit more equated, but they were progressing intensity. Now, there's, generally speaking, always going to be a slight increase in volume through those phases and a slight increase in intensity. It's just that one is being more favored over the other. What that tells you straight away is that actually there's progress to be made from increasing either progressing volume and keeping intensity a little bit more fixed, or increasing intensity and keeping the other a little bit more fixed. Now, there are certain training protocols, and we mentioned this when you were off air, Mark, that there are some training protocols which will push both. Often that will push you into a very overreach state, but that's on purpose, because it's this idea of overreaching, then backing right off and achieving what's called supercompensation. That's a bit more technical, and that's maybe for another time. But, listen, there are different protocols that either progress one, the other, or both, and either separately or in tandem. So what that should tell you is that both work. However, what's more relevant potentially, and what are the different schools of thought behind it? Well, when you look at Olympic lifting athletes, if you look at where, for example, periodization initially came from, it actually came from the need to cycle on and off drug dosages. Because if you look at what periodization started as, it was actually to manage that more than the actual training. So it was for, Russian coaches, for example, to be able to apply, right, we're going to put in this dosage of drugs at this time to enable them to push super hard in their training to achieve those adaptations, and then we're going to cycle them off. And that was actually how periodization kind of began, was through Russian strength sports and the cycling on and off of different drug cycles. However, that actually gives a bit of an idea, well, hold on a minute, there's something to having this kind of structured way of kind of progressing our training and keeping things in a bit more fixed. And one thing you've always got to hand to the Russians and to the Chinese is they're incredibly scientific about how they approach these sports and how they approach training. And they always seem to be like 2 steps ahead of the UK and the US, which really frustrates all of the US, because they always want to be the best at everything, right? So where that leads us on to today, so this idea of kind of intensification and accumulation started making its way into the mainstream fitness industry, and this is where Paul then popularized it. And as time has then progressed, some people have felt a bigger response to or they've felt intrinsically that progressing volume was more effective for them. And then you've got this other camp that felt that progressing intensity was more effective for them while keeping volume very minimal. And that kind of then leads us into this 2 camps that we have at the moment. So, for example, let's start with the volume camp. So what is volume? Well, training volume essentially is just the total workload done across a given session and across a given phase. And when we say total workload, that means number of reps, total weight, and you multiply the number of reps by the total weight lifted for a given exercise, and that will give you volume. Now, there are more complex constructs of what volume actually is, but to keep things really simple, we'll just keep it as that, as the total tonnage lifted across a session. Of course, strength or having high amounts of load on certain exercises can definitely contribute to that, but generally speaking, we're looking on an exercise per exercise basis. Take it out of the context of multi-joint movements just for the moment, or just doing, for example, for strength sports, because for strength sports, remember, we're looking for specificity. We're trying to get specific adaptations to improve at a sport. When we talk about it in our context as coaches and what we do with our clients at the Body Collective, we're talking about it in a bit more general adaptation context, where we're trying to get clients to achieve a general response to achieve muscle growth. Now, a lot of people would say, well, is that not specificity? I think it's just important to separate specificity from a sports perspective and specific adaptations. Those are 2 just slightly different things. There's general adaptations we get, and then there's specific adaptations as well. So, and related to our clients, volume would just be the idea that, say week 1, they're lifting X number of, keeping the weight the same, and they might have a rep range of, say, 8 to 12. Across the 4 weeks, they might be lifting 3 sets, 8 reps. That gives them a certain volume for that exercise. As they go for week 2, it might be they do 3 sets of 10. Week 3, they might get to 3 sets of 12, and then they're at the point where they've reached the top end of their rep range. That's a very clear progression in volume. Intensity hasn't necessarily went up yet. However, if they reach the top end of the rep range, The idea would then be that you increase the load then and bring the reps back down again. So now you're back down to that 8 reps, but you've got higher weight. So intensity's climbed up just a little bit. However, when you drop those reps down from that 12 reps, for example, at the top of the rep range back down to 8, there's going to be a slight drop off in volume. You're willing to take that small drop off in volume because you've now increased the load, and you're now going to start progressing volume, i.e. reps, across those sets with that given load. And that's essentially what we'd call like the double progression model, which is very popular within volume training. You're generally speaking going to want to milk everything you can out of a given load, progress that as much as you can. It might even be that it's not just reps, it might even be time under tension. You might do slower concentric or eccentric tempos, for example, within that. But then the volume technically doesn't change, but the adaptation to that stimulus will slightly as well. So this is where things can start to become a little bit more nuanced and complex. But to keep things simple, we'll just keep it within volume and intensity. But that hopefully just gives you an idea that on a logbook, you can have the same volume, but the execution of that exercise can be radically altered to achieve a different outcome. So as far as volume is concerned, it's this idea of lifting more total tonnage over time. At some stage, your body will get to a point where it's no longer in a position to take further adaptations because it's reached a point where you're starting to get very fatigued, your nervous system's starting to get affected, you're just not able to make progress from week to week anymore. You've maybe had 2 or 3 weeks in a row where progress has stalled on a movement. That's at a point where, okay, volume stalled, it's now time to potentially back off. And that's generally speaking how a more volume-based approach to training is usually done. If we look at a training program, what does that potentially look like? And what are some of the more popular components of volume? So you've got, for example, Dr. Mike Israetel is one of the main proponents of kind of volume-based training, as is people like Steve Hall at Revive Stronger, and there's a couple of other guys who follow that sort of approach as well. And it's this idea that they kind of keep what's called reps in reserve. So they're never ever really taken a muscle all the way to failure, apart from maybe 1 week of like, say, a 4 or 5 week cycle. And in their belief system, it's the idea that volume is the key driver of muscle growth, and that actually by increasing intensity, you start to trade off what's known as essentially a fatigue to stimulus ratio, whereby, okay, the closer I take my reps to failure, I'm inducing a hell of a lot more fatigue, but not necessarily for that bit more stimulus. And so the way that Mike Israetel explains it is that as you get closer to failure, the level of fatigue shoots up dramatically, but the level of stimulus you get from that doesn't quite match it. And so this is their argument essentially for this idea that there's no need to constantly be going to failure all the time because you impose a hell of a lot of fatigue, but not for as much stimulus. That's obviously been questioned and argued, but we'll come on to that in the second part of this. So then the way that these programs are often set up is that essentially they will keep 3 reps in reserve, say week 1, 2 reps in reserve week 2, 3 reps in reserve week 3, and then they'll go all the way to failure on week 4. Then they'll have a deload week on week 5, and then they'll repeat that process all over again. Something else that they will do from essentially what's called a mesocycle to mesocycle is in, say, cycle 1, which is, say, a block of 5 weeks. They might start off with, say, 3 working sets of an exercise. As they get to mesocycle 2, when they've resensitized after that deload, they might then do 4 sets of an exercise. And this is how they progress things. They build up to find what the maximal recoverable volume is, which means the total number of sets for a body part that you can do across a week. And they'll figure out where that threshold is, and they'll work up towards that, and then they'll back off. So that's, in very, very short terms, the kind of volume-based model that you tend to see out there. There are also terms out there like minimum effective volume, such as what's the lowest amount of volume I can do to get an adaptation. Anything below that's not going to quite give me what I need because I've already adapted to the demands of previous training phases. But that, generally speaking, is going to be the volume progression model. Mark, do you want to add anything to that? Anything that you've seen from different people, different places?
Not really on a volume, or we're just talking on volume at the minute.
Yeah.
Not really. Yeah, I have seen it work. Obviously in different people, and it's very interesting you mentioned. Yeah, I follow Mike a lot. It's very interesting you mentioned that 3 reps in the tank, 2 reps in the tank, 1 rep in the tank. So even though they're not hitting failure, they're still hitting close to failure.
Yeah.
They're still training hard. The problem is people are doing this and they're keeping 5 to 10 reps in the tank, whether it'll be from volume training or whether it'll be from intensity training, which we will talk about in a minute. So as I say, like lots of people I see in gyms these days are running around doing superset circuits and they're lifting on a volume-based workout, but they're still not even having enough, like they're doing warm-up sets. They're not keeping 3 reps in the tank or 2 reps in the tank. And also to do this effectively, it needs very careful planning. You can't just throw it together and decide, right, this week I'm going to do this and next week. You have to carefully plan. Now, obviously, his programs work. And to be honest, I think like any program will work for people. Obviously, some things work for others, and this is where experimentation comes into plan. But basically, like if you did any program and you haven't trained in a while, or you did intensity, can you interchange intensity and volume? Meaning, would you change the volume program and still get results? Probably, because first, what does training do? It causes a stress. Second, what happens? The body adapts. So whether it be you change over the volume training, because I've done this a lot. I've done a lot of, which we'll talk about, intensity, heavy lifting. We'll talk about guys like Dante Trudel, DC training. I've done it a lot. But I found at a certain point, my joints would feel it. And then I changed to a volume-based training. And Brad Schoenfeld put a really good point, really good study, which we talked about before this, on how that volume training might work as opposed to intensity training, but they still both work. So basically, yeah, it's such an interesting topic, and there's a lot more study needs done on it. But what I would say for a client is obviously just experiment and see what works for you.
Definitely. And it's funny what you say about there's a lot of studies to be done, because that's the thing. When you look at even the Mike Israetel framework of how he set up maximal recoverable volume, minimal effective volume, these are constructs he's made. Like, there's not something that's set in stone. It's just a way that he's tried to create a framework to say, well, this is how we might go about managing volume parameters within someone's training cycle. Like you said, I've done both as well. I've seen both. I've also applied both in both a strength sport context and a physique or hypertrophy context, and seen pros and cons of each. And I think that before we dive into the intensity and some of maybe the pros and cons of volume as well, we're not saying one is necessarily better than the other. We're just trying to essentially provide you what we've seen, what kind of seems to be the general gist of both. And then you have to really, it's always going to be the case of take the information and you make your own mind up. That's always going to be the case. So if we just finish off on the volume stuff, what are the pros of the volume stuff? It's, as long as you have a structured plan, it's quite easy to follow, to track, to progress. It is a bit kinder on the nervous system because you're not taking the body so close to failure and inducing that high level of fatigue and neural fatigue and muscular fatigue. And like Mark said, the closer you start taking joints to failure and the more reps that you have in proximity to failure, then obviously risk to reward starts to increase as well. So who may potentially suit a higher intensity program? We'll get round to that, but who might suit a slightly higher volume program? Well, in the beginning, as far as volume is concerned, for a lot of beginners, that's going to be super effective because they've not learned how to contract muscle as effectively as a more advanced lifter. They're not going to have the ability to be able to take their body all the way to complete muscular failure, because, for example, they might have high lactate accumulation, which you see for a lot of clients. They can't withstand that burning feeling they get from certain exercises. They're nowhere near muscular failure, but they just can't quite go there yet. They don't have the power, they don't have the lactate buffering capacity. So for them, in order to them to get an effective stimulus, they're actually going to have to leave some reps in reserve, intentionally or unintentionally, but they're going to have to do more sets to achieve the same stimulus. So I would say that the volume approach for most beginner clients probably makes a bit more sense, as long as it's appropriately managed, because there's one thing doing 3 sets of an exercise, there's one thing doing 5 sets of an exercise. Now, what are potentially the cons? Well, I'll start with the beginner side of things first. So what we see a lot of is, I like to refer to it as, you see runners and they do junk miles is the term, where they just run miles for the sake of running miles. Well, this often happens in the gym as well. People just do volume for volume's sake. Now, what volume often becomes a mass for is that it becomes a mass for poorly executed exercise. So, for example, they could have got that response from 3 sets of an exercise done incredibly well with good execution, well and precise application. But you get all these guys that walk in the gym, I'll just give lateral as an example, and they're chucking things around and throwing things all over the place, arcing their back. They're going to need 5 sets to get that stimulus because they're not directing it in an effective manner. And so they have to do the jump volume to make up for the stimulus that they didn't get for effective reps. So when I think of volume, personally, I look at, well, what's the effective volume? And that's the key word, effective, because you can just do volume and it can be a lot of dog shit. It can just be horrible reps, not placing tension specifically on the target muscle you're trying to grow and stimulate. and you can just do volume for volume's sake. So there's definitely a sweet spot in there where you're trying to get that perfect marriage between really well executed exercise, but also having a sufficient amount of intensity to drive an effective amount of volume. So as coaches, it's our job, and I'm sure Mark will agree, it's our job in the beginning, we're working especially with most gym pop clients, is to find the right amount of volume for them at the starting point as an individual to induce enough stimulus, but it's got to be done in an effective and accurate way. Where the drawback of volume can come in, say you are a bit more experienced or you're doing the whole reps and reserve type approach. Like Mark said, often many people don't really truly understand what reps and reserve are because they don't know what failure is. You can't do reps and reserve if you've never understood what true failure feels like. And so if you've never experienced what true failure feels like, how do you know what reps and reserve are? Because you don't know what failure is. I think I've just repeated myself twice there. But so the point is that I think for people who are going to implement the reps and reserve technique, you need to have an understanding of what failure feels like. So I don't think it's a case of doing one and sticking to one forever. You're going to have to try both. And you're then going to have to figure out whether you're someone who's going to interchange between the two. Where I think the intensity style training comes in is I think more experienced lifters will generally respond well to that if it suits them as an individual. Like you say, if the joints can take it, if it suits their mentality to training, which is another thing as well. Some people just don't want to go there. They don't want to take it all the way to failure on every working set. It doesn't work with them. They can't do it. They can't do it on their own. They maybe need a training partner to do it. So in that case, following a reps and reserve type approach for that individual might be good because it gives them a framework. They're able to still get enough effective reps. We call it essentially proximity to failure, enough reps within proximity to failure to achieve a stimulus. However, if you're someone who really, really likes training hard and really going to failure, you're going to feel like you're not quite getting what you need from that particular training session because you're kind of always trying to figure out how you're going to leave it in the tank, but really you just want to go all in. Now, there is an argument as to why you might not do that, but that's maybe for another time. So yeah, just to summarize on the volume side of things, the pros are going to be that you're not taking quite close to failure, so you can stave off some of that neural fatigue or essentially general CNS fatigue. You're going to be able to potentially better manage technique with slightly lighter loads. You're able to take it through more sets. Probably one of the cons I never touched on was the time that it can take to follow a volume-based program. It can be very time-consuming. The cons of volume can often be in reps and reserve is that it's often difficult to gauge what reps and reserve are. If you're not careful about appropriately dosing volume, you can end up doing an excessive amount of volume that can be also harmful on the joints. It can also create a lot of metabolic stress beyond what we want, a lot of oxidative stress that we don't need as far as a recoverability standpoint is concerned. So that would be the pros and cons mainly from my point of view on volume. Anything you want to add to that, Mark, before we hit intensity?
No, that's covered.
Cool. So let's move on to intensity. So intensity proponents that you probably are aware of, and as Mark rightly touched on, people who have been in maybe the bodybuilding world especially will have heard of guys like Dante Trudell and his dog crap training method. That was then taken on a little bit further by the likes of Dr. Scott Stevenson and fortitude training, which you've probably heard of as well, Mark.
Yeah, I've done them all. I've done the DC training, I've done fortitude, I've got the fortitude book. So trust me, every single workout in the world that's out there, I've read it.
Yeah,
and probably tried it.
Yeah, I'm actually running fortitude at the moment. I'm on
wow.
fortitude. So,
yeah,
so that'll be interesting to see.
Huge fan of Scott Conley. Such an intelligent guy. And man, when that guy talks about hypertrophy, he really knows what he's talking about. Amazing to listen to. I've listened to maybe 10 or 12 of his podcasts in the past. Phenomenal.
Yeah, he's a super nice guy as well. He just, everything's very he's never ever absolutist. It's all very research driven, experience driven. Yeah, he's very cool to listen to.
Actually, a good idea. Maybe might get him on a podcast in the near future.
Well, I'll tell you what, and I know we should never do this cardinal sin of promoting someone else's podcast, but the Muscle Mentors had Scott Stevenson on, Dr. Scott Stevenson on. It was 2 hours and 40 minutes, that conversation, but it was absolute gold. Very, very good.
I need to listen to that one.
Yeah, very good. Very technical, though. They even went into things like length-tension relationship and sarcomere lineup and all that sort of stuff. So very technical. So let's talk about intensity. So what does that mean? It means it's this idea of keeping volume at a very minimal amount in order to achieve an adaptation, but driving training intensity, which just means total load. So this idea of working at super high intensities relative to 1 rep max, taking working sets all the way to failure, induces a very high amount of fatigue, but it also induces a very high stimulus for those that are willing to venture into that realm. In terms of potential how it's programmed. Generally speaking, the programs won't change much over a long period of time. Usually you'll find an intensity-based program tends to be very similar for anywhere between 16 weeks, even as long as 24, 30 weeks, or even longer in some cases, because the goal is literally to progress intensity over a long period of time. Now, the way that we tend to see exercises subbed in and out is that exercises will literally be rinsed for as long as they possibly can. Once you've had 2 or 3 weeks where you're no longer making progress, that exercise will be switched out generally for another variation. That's generally speaking how most intensity programs run. Minimal changes to exercise selection, only when needed. Volume stays as low as it possibly can while trying to drive up intensity over the coming weeks. Now, if you look at programs like DC or like Fortitude, they tend to run on what's called different tiers, where you kind of have different volume tiers. But if you had to look at what they consider as high volume, that would potentially look like a low volume program in the volume camp, for example. So for example, if I look at Fortitude, we have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Tier 2, most of the exercises are 2 working sets, maximum. Maybe 1 working set for, like, if you look at the loading days, for example, on Fortitude, it's like 2 for the thigh, so it's 2 for, you know, a big double joint movement, and then it might be 1 working set for the quad, 1 working set for the hamstring, done. Now, a lot of people would think, Jesus, like literally 4 working sets for the legs, and that's your leg day, and that's it done. You go to the volume camp and you're looking at anything from 15 upwards, people doing crazy amount of volume for different things. So it's a very different school of thought, very different way of thinking, but the execution application is quite a bit different as far as how close to failure you go and the sheer level of effort and intensity you give to every single working set. What they often don't tell you in intensification style programs is that they do a hell of a lot of warm-up sets to get ready for that intensification, you know, those top sets. And often what tends to happen is you have like a top loading set and often a back off set in some styles of programs. Not all programs run like that, but it's a very popular method. And I'm sure again, Mark, you've tried everything. There was this, I don't know if there's a specific program that popularized it, but it was this idea. I think it was DC training, to be honest. It was mostly the popularization of this, but this idea of having a top loading set and then backing off 20 to 30% and doing like a back off set, taking both to failure. That's often what a lot of intensity-based programs will do as well. So what are the pros of intensity-based programs? Well, volume is minimized. So generally speaking, it's very rare that you're going to exceed a recoverable amount of volume, because you're just never ever going past a crazy amount of sets. If executed right, it can potentially help to mitigate issues on the joints, because you're not taking the joints through so many repetitions of being lengthened and shortened. Cons of intensity-based training is you need to be pretty experienced to be able to go there. You need to be able to actually train hard enough to be able to get yourself to complete muscular failure. You have to be able to buffer lactate sufficiently so that you're not stopping because the muscle burns or that it hurts because of the byproducts that are being produced. You have to actually be able to take yourself all the way to full mechanical muscular failure where you physically can't move the load. So that's one con of it. If you're not able to actually get yourself there, then you might not get the most from that training approach. The other con, as Mark rightly said, is that if you do it for long periods of time and if you're not very good at auto-regulating like your deloads or taking time off from lifting heavy, you can end up running yourself into a bit of a hole where you get your CNS really fatigued and you potentially are going to really beat up your joints. My first foray into intensity-based training, I ended up doing a little bit of some stuff to my knees because I didn't really know when to back off. I kind of just kept pushing, and I ended up with a little bit of knee niggles. I've kind of got rid of those now. But that can be one of the back offs. If it's not appropriately programmed and it's not well managed, you can potentially dig yourself a bit of a hole as far as both the central nervous system and your joints as well. Is there anything you want to add to that, Mark?
It's just basically, it's for me, like programming, a very important consideration is joint integrity.
Yeah.
And about a word you mentioned there, auto-regulation. Basically, you're pushing to the point where I used to tell people years ago when we did this type of training, I would have pushed them hard for 3 or 4 weeks, and then they had a deload for the fourth or fifth week, and then pushed again. So that was the premise of the DC training. That was where you had a 4 to 6 week push and then possibly a 2 week deload. The DC training started with rest pause training. So your one main set was the rest pause where you did your all out set, then you rested 20 seconds, go again, rested 20 seconds. So like 3 mini sets with the same weight. I think like the top set and the back off set came later on. More like Jordan Peters started doing a lot of that. I don't know where it originated, but I feel that the reason being is because potentially the rest pause set would take a lot more on the joint, because it is pretty hard and taxing on the joints. And then basically, yeah, there's different intensity techniques, such as rest pause, cluster sets. I know muscle rounds from fortitude training.
Yep.
So there's like so much. And then I all like it for me, I feel like everything depends on what level the trainee is at. Is it a complete beginner? Is it beginner level 2? Is it intermediate? And is it the more advanced trainee, which will need probably like to employ more intensity factors? I feel like a lot of trainers push too much intensity factors from the start. I'm a huge fan of progressive overload and working off one main set and getting stronger with that. And it's funny because there's two different skills, volume training and basically the intensity. And the volume trainers might do 4 sets per exercise, whereas the intensity trainers might still have 4 sets, but 3 of them might be warm-ups and 1 might be a big set. Yeah. So overall, it's like they have to ask themselves, right, because this should be whole, like Dorian Yates 1 main set. We still did 3 warm-ups if we go back to Mike Menser. So they're still in the gym. Obviously, there is the higher volume training and they're in the gym forever. So yeah, just with the intensity type training, it's definitely learning someone how to be intuitive, or learning someone the cues of when it is time to back off, because people will push and push and push to the point of an injury or just to the point of into overtraining.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, I think one thing I often mention, I think I had this chat with Cal as well, is that it's actually quite tough to overtrain, and very rarely will people ever overtrain. Yeah. It's more under recovery is a big issue. And this idea of kind of putting yourself into a hole where you're just not recovering from sessions, that's not a good place to be. You need to listen to your body. But unfortunately, the kind of hardcore mentality, no days off, often guys will kind of just push through niggles and pain, and that's not a good place to be in either. And I think something that you touched on that I was meant to say, but I think I sidetracked off, was exactly right with the intensity guys. What they often don't realize, like if I think back to when I was doing my top set, back off set style program, I had 4 or 5 warm-up sets before I got to the top set. That all accumulates as volume as well. And this is the part that they often don't tell you, is like that's still going to count to your overall volume in a session. There's still going to be some form of stimulus there. So that's important to note. I think the last point I wanted to touch on, just to kind of summarize or close off, not necessarily the debate, but like what to maybe consider between both styles of training. So I think both Mark and I agree that you can do one or the other and you can achieve success. You can get gains from whether you progress volume or whether you progress intensity, or both. I think where I've kind of seen anecdotally from my own experience with my own training and training clients is there is only so far that you can really take volume for a given individual, but at some stage, they're going to have to learn how to train harder, and they're going to have to get stronger. And then once they are able to do that, it might be that you're able to progress volume a little bit more, but then there'll become a point where you reach a ceiling of volume, and the only other option is to get stronger and to work harder. And so I think for me, at least, it's never that there's always one over the other, that it's always going to be a case that one may be holding back your ability to progress the other potentially. But I would say that the inability to lift more weight is going to hold back your ability to accumulate volume more than the other way around. Like lifting more volume doesn't necessarily get you stronger. However, you have to get stronger potentially in order to be able to accumulate more load in your working sets. So that's kind of, I guess, how I tend to view the intensity versus volume debate. Is both are useful, but you may have to cycle back and forth between the two in order to get the advantages of both systems. What's your thoughts on that, Mark?
Yeah, 100%. Who, like one person we haven't mentioned, who I'm a huge fan of, and he talks more about advanced trainees, is John Meadows' Mountain Dog Diet. So he incorporates I must have about 10, paid for 10 of his workouts, which are over like some are 6 weeks, but most are like 12 weeks. So he incorporates volume with intensity. But he has a system where he'll do a supermax set and he'll have maybe one intensity set in the whole workout. And it works phenomenally well. I have found like I respond, and I feel like anybody respond. Remember, the thing is, people get into workouts and they do the workouts for 2 or 3 weeks. They see a new workout in a magazine and change it. when they're only in the stress phase of the workout and not knowing if it's going to work for them. So basically, if you come out of the stress phase, you haven't reached the adaptation phase to know if it's working for you. So someone has to give like a workout at least 6 weeks, unless something drastically is going wrong in the first initial weeks. And the problem is program hopping. And this is a massive issue. People just don't stay on workouts long enough. And yes, like over time, you will go through becoming a beginner to an intermediate to advanced over time. And it is good experimenting with different programs as long as you give each program enough time. And you will find that, like at the start, I'd done DC for a long time, and then I didn't believe in volume. Then I went to volume and got growth. Then I went back to D, and I pretty much like interchanging them, especially because of joints and joint integrity. But again, definitely like there's a lot more research to be done on it. But even with the research, like where do we learn our experiences? In the trenches and in the gym. Yeah. And most of the guys develop intuition with their own training that just works for them. They know what works for them. When you get to a certain standard and level, if you're taught correctly, then you will get to that point and realize, right, this works for me or this doesn't work for me, or probably they both work, but we can interchange them throughout different phases. Just like nutrition should be in different phases, like fat loss, maintenance. Could we do the same with training? Yes, potentially, yes.
Yeah, definitely agree. And it's funny because I've spent the last 18 months with Cam doing a lot of intensity focused training, but what I enjoy the most is volume. Like I enjoy doing lots of sets. I enjoy doing the work and getting a good pump on. And so it is interesting. Like you have to kind of challenge your own biases and go into different systems and take what you can from them. And then, okay, I'll park that for a while and I'll do something else. But like you said, and this was actually one of my...
Like I've seen like both natural and people using anabolics, both guys responding amazingly well to volume and other guys responding amazingly well to intensity. Will that last forever? Potentially not. Then is the point when you can probably interchange them potentially.
Cool, guys. So I will just give a summary of the conversation. So when it comes to volume or intensity, both can work. It's just going to be context dependent. It's going to be experience dependent. As far as, if we had to choose one side over the other, I don't think we can really do that. But at some stage, we are going to have to get stronger. We are going to have to be able to work harder than we currently do. We are going to have to learn how to go to failure. But it may be worth switching back and forth between different methods of volume and intensity in order to get the most from each style of training, each type of progression. One thing we want to be very careful on is we want to make sure that we are not... For example, one of my biggest criticisms of the accumulation intensification phases is that the training programs just change way too much, like changing programs way too often. And to touch on Mark's final point there, we don't want to be swapping out training programs every 4 weeks, because realistically, we're only really acquiring the skill of that particular exercise within the first 2 to 4 weeks. Only then can we continue to then make progression from that point onwards if we actually do it over a long enough period of time. So generally speaking, it's do not ditch a program hop too early. Whether you choose to do a volume-based approach or intensity-based approach, make sure you stick with that program long enough in order to be able to execute it effectively and to be able to see the progress and the gains from that. From that, guys, we'll wrap up for the moment. So hopefully that was a useful and potentially insightful and thought-provoking look into different styles of training and how to progress volume and or intensity. Definitely no absolutism in this podcast. We're always just going to be about providing high-quality information, giving you viewpoints based on evidence, based on our experience and what we've seen with ourselves and with our clients as well. We'll wrap it up there for today, but thank you again for attending another episode of the Better Body Radio Show. The best way you can possibly support us, guys, is to get onto your favorite podcast platform, whatever one you're listening to now. Leave us a 5-star review, especially if you're on Apple iTunes. That helps us get in front of more people, being able to deliver more podcasts and content like this very podcast, being able to deliver more value to more people. That's the best way you can possibly help us. If you're watching this on YouTube, drop a comment in the comment section below the video, and we'll look forward to bringing you some future episodes. Also, let us know, what topics do you want us to cover? Are there any burning questions that you've been wanting to know, maybe some answers to, that you're just not finding concrete answers from, looking elsewhere? But other than that, guys, signing off. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.